So, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to welcome Gareth Powell to the bookshop. Feel free to don't be stuck in your seat if you need to get a glass of wine, or please help yourself. We try to keep it a little bit informal here. Thank you to Gareth for coming all the way from Bristol, and Matthew for organising it for us. I believe many of you may have been in the workshop earlier today, but I think we're going to be talking more monkeys. Thank you, Gareth.
How many of you were actually in the workshop then? Most of you, okay. This lets you see now that whether or not I was full of rubbish or I knew what I was talking about. Alright, I've got a couple of readings with me. One's I haven't decided which one to do yet. One's a short story set in Wales, and the other one is the opening chapter of the first Monkey book, so I'm not sure which one. By show of hands, which one should I go for? Monkey book? 2, 3, 5, or short story set in Wales? It's Monkey book, I'm afraid. I'm going to be the monkey man now till I die, I know it. I can never get him off my back. I'm going to sit down because I'm old. And I'm going to wear reading glasses because I'm old. I've finally come out of the closet about these. Right. Has anyone actually read this yet? Good man. Yeah, okay, so most of you this will be new. This chapter doesn't actually feature the monkey. Because I wanted to show there are other things going on in this book apart from hairy shenanigans. Okay, this is called chapter 1, and it's called. Can you hear me at the back, by the way? Yeah. This is called Victoria at Paddington. The moment Victoria Valois stepped down from the Heathrow train, she saw the detective waiting for her at the ticket barrier. He was there to escort her to her dead husband's apartment. Slowly she walked towards him. Fresh off the train after her flight from Paris, she still wore the thick army surplus coat and heavy boots she'd pulled on that morning. As she walked, she could feel the retractable quarterstaff in her pocket bump against her thigh. She sniffed the air. Under different circumstances, it might have been nice to have been back in London. Paddington's concourse smelled the way she remembered, of engine grease and fast food. Trains pulled in and out. Metal luggage trolleys rattled. Pigeons flapped under the glazed wrought iron roof. She stopped in front of the barrier. I'm Valois. Welcome to London, Miss Valois. I'm Detective Constable Simon Malhotra. We spoke on the phone. He glanced behind her. Do you need any help with your bags? Victoria shook her head. I haven't bought any. I'm hoping this won't take long. Ah, of course. Outside the station, the pavements were slick with rain. He led her to his car and opened the passenger door. Shall we go straight there, or do you need to freshen up first? Victoria ducked into the preferred seat. The car was an old Citroën, its interior warm with the autumnal odours of cold coffee, damp clothes and cheap pine air freshener. A half-eaten croissant lay on the grimy dashboard, wrapped in a napkin. She wrinkled her nose. Let's just get this over with, shall we? Malhotra closed the door and hurried around to the driver's side. Okay. He settled behind the wheel and loosened his tie. He pressed the ignition and Victoria heard the electric engine spin up, whining into life. The wipers clunked back and forth, the indicator light ticked, and Malhotra eased the car out into the late morning traffic. Victoria let her head fall back against the headrest. As the Skyliner ground its way across the channel, she hadn't bothered trying to sleep. The bunk in her cabin had remained undisturbed. She'd spent most of the night in a chair by the porthole, using her jacket as a blanket, watching the rain clump and slither on the glass, smudging the lights of the other gondolas, asking herself the same question over and over again. How could Paul possibly be dead? Malhotra took them out onto Edgware Road, then south past Marble Arch and onto Park Lane. The road and sky were as grey and wet as each other. So, he glanced across her as they passed the gaunt trees and black railings of Hyde Park. Is this your first time in London? Victoria didn't bother turning her head. I worked for 3 years as the London correspondent for Le Monde, she said. I met my husband here. He worked for Celeste Technologies. We moved to Paris when they offered him a position there. Malhotra sucked his teeth. He seemed embarrassed to have brought up the subject. Your husband? Yes, of course. They came to Hyde Park Corner and the Wellington Arch, with its statue of a black iron chariot. Suddenly they were in 5 lanes of traffic. Rain fell in front of bright red brake lights. Black hackney cabs jostled for position. Absently, Victoria touched her fingers to the side of her head and felt her nails scrape the thick ridge of scar tissue concealed behind the curtain of her hair. We separated a few months ago. He moved back here. But you are from Paris. Originally, oui, c'est ça. And now you live on a Skyliner. That must be exciting. She shrugged at his enthusiasm. A double-decker bus drew alongside, windows steamed. It's okay. She watched the rain coat the brick and stone of London, capital city of the United European Commonwealth, site of the European Parliament, and seat of His Majesty King William V. She hadn't been back here in over a year. Oh, Paul. She took a long breath. Can you tell me something, detective? The young man spared her another glance. Sure, if I can. How did he die? Ahead, a traffic light turned red. Malhotra downshifted the gears and brought the car to a standstill. He was murdered. Victoria squeezed her fists together in her lap. I know that. I just don't know how he died. The light flickered to amber, then green. Malhotra let out the clutch and the Citroen's electric motor pulled them forward. He took a right onto Brompton Road and then a left onto Sloane Street. Victoria's neural software tracked their progress via an online map. In her mind's eye, a blinking red arrow marked her current position. The streets laid out in tangles around it. If she wanted to, she could zoom right into pavement level, or right out until the world seemed the size of a football held at arm's length. She would never be lost. As long as she had a wireless connection, she would always know exactly where she was. Are you sure you want to know? Malhotra's tone suggested he was trying to protect her. Victoria rubbed her eyes with forefinger and thumb, dispelling the map display. To hear the grisly details of her husband's murder was pretty much the last thing she wanted right now. Yet that old journalistic instinct itched at her and wouldn't let her go. She had to know the full story, whatever the cost. Someone should know what happened to him, she said reasonably. Someone who loved him. The detective puffed air through his cheeks. All right, then. If you're sure. He gave her a sideways glance. But not here. I'll go through it all with you when we get to the flat, okay? They passed over Vauxhall Bridge and into Battersea. Paul's apartment lay on the second floor of a building by the river, opposite a Renault car dealership. Malhotra parked on the dealership's forecourt. As today was a Sunday, the business was closed. Come on, he said. He led her across the road to the front of the apartment block, with its beige brickwork and chipped black iron railings. The rain dampened her hair, and she could feel her heart fluttering in her chest. Although the cool, detached part of her brain, the part that she didn't really think of as her, told her Paul was dead, the news still hadn't really sunk in at a gut level. She hadn't assimilated it properly. Even now, as they climbed the steps to his apartment, she half expected to find him inside when she opened the door. He'd be standing there in his kitchen, wearing one of his ridiculous Hawaiian shirts, laughing at her for being so gullible. He couldn't be dead. He couldn't leave her feeling this empty and desolate. He just couldn't. She fingered the retractable quarterstaff in her pocket and thought back to the moment she'd first been given the news. She'd been on top of the Skyliner when one of the Commodore's stewards came to find her. She'd been working through her morning routine on the main helipad, practicing her stick-fighting technique. The dawn breeze chilled her sweat. The retractable carbon fibre staff whirled in her hand, its weight solid and reassuring. Left shoulder, right shoulder, block, parry. Her technique mixed traditional European stick fighting with moves stolen from the Japanese disciplines of Jodo and Bujitsu. She was recording the session on her neural prosthesis and live streaming it to a laboratory near Paris, where the surgeons who had rebuilt her could use the data to monitor the continuing integration of the neural and artificial components in her brain. Beneath her bare feet, the Skyliner Tereshkova ground its way across France, its nuclear-powered propellers labouring against a stiff westerly. Almost a kilometre in length, the giant airship consisted of 5 rigid cigar-shaped hulls bound side by side in a raft formation. The 2 outermost hulls sported engine nacelles and large rudder fins. The 3 inner hulls glittered with promenade decks, satellite dishes and helipads. That morning, Victoria had the largest pad to herself, atop the Skyliner's central hull. All was silent, save for the flap of the wind and the hum of the engines. Far ahead, an ice cream tower of cumulus caught the sun as it stretched 12,000 feet into the sky above Paris. Her calves ached. She had been practicing hard for an hour. Her feet were sore from slapping and twisting on the hard rubber surface. Her shoulder muscles burned with the effort of swinging her staff. Still, she kept practicing, pushing herself to exhaustion. The sweat flew from her with every move. The staff felt like an extension of her will. Yet, even as she drew herself into the physicality of the dance, an internal stillness remained, a part of her mind unaffected by adrenaline and fatigue. Following her accident, surgeons had been forced to install artificial neurons, replacing large sections of her damaged brain with pliable, gel-based processors. Although the surgery had saved her life, it had left her unable to read or write. Where once she'd spent her days dashing off articles and blog posts, her brain now refused to pass written text. When she looked at a newspaper headline or a ThinkPad screen, all she saw were squiggles. And the only way she could decode them was via a text recognition app loaded into the gelware. The app stimulated the speech centres of her brain so that her lips moved as she read, and she gleaned the meaning of the words as she heard herself speak them. The process was slow and often frustrating, and the app prone to mistakes. Her hands squeezed the staff as she tried to channel her frustration into the fight. Left shin, right shin, step back, pivot. She slid forward on the balls of her feet, reached up and brought the end of the staff smacking down onto the head of her imaginary opponent. Hey! She let the swing's momentum drop her to her knees. Sweat dripped from her forehead onto the black rubber of the helipad. Her chest heaved. She might be half machine, but the alternative was worse, and every breath a victory of sorts. After a few lungfuls, she looked up and saw one of the Skyliner's white-jacketed stewards standing nervously at the top of the stairwell. She straightened up and walked over to where she'd left her towel. Yes? The steward cleared his throat. The Commodore sends his compliments, ma'am. He would like you to join him at your earliest convenience. It seems there's a message for you, from London. Victoria rubbed her face and then draped the towel over her shoulder. She retracted the staff to a 12th of its length and slipped it into her pocket. Do I have time to shower and change? The steward glanced at her, taking in her damp hair, her stained black vest and sweatpants. That may be advisable, ma'am. And so, 10 minutes later, scrubbed and combed, Victoria knocked at the door of the Commodore's cabin, down in the main gondola, just behind the bridge. She had pulled on a pair of black jeans and a crew neck sweater. Her hair was clean but tied back, revealing the thick scar on her right temple. Come in, Victoria, come in. The Commodore rose from behind a large aluminium desk. He wore a white military dress jacket, open at the neck, and a cutlass dangled from his belt. Victoria's legs were stiff from the workout. The Commodore invited her to take a seat. From his desk he pulled a bottle of Russian vodka and 2 glasses. He filled them both and slid one across to her. Drink this, he said. He had white hair and black eyebrows and ivory yellow teeth that seemed too large for his mouth. Although he insisted on speaking Russian to his crew, he always spoke English for her. Partly because he had a soft spot for her, and partly because he knew from experience that her grasp of the Russian language extended only as far as the phrase, I can't pronounce that. which she was pretty sure meant I don't speak Russian. She touched the glass with one finger, turning it slightly, but didn't pick it up. Most of the back wall of the cabin was taken up by a large picture window. Through it she could see one of the engine nacelles under the Skyliner's outermost starboard hull. She could feel the faint vibration of the airship's engines through the metal deck. "What's going on?" she asked. The Commodore picked an imaginary speck of lint from the knee of his cavalry trousers. "There's a call from you from England." He picked the phone handset from his desk and passed it to her. "But I am very much afraid it is bad news." At the top of the stairs, Detective Constable Malhotra pushed the key into the lock of the apartment door, turned it, and let the door swing open. The lights were off in the hallway. He gestured for her to go in first. "Try not to touch anything that's marked." He checked his watch impatiently. He obviously had places he'd rather be. Victoria ignored him. She hesitated on the threshold. As a former reporter, this wasn't the first murder scene she'd had cause to visit, but it was the first in which she'd had such a personal stake. She knew that as soon as she set foot in the flat, she'd have to start accepting the truth and admit to herself that she really had lost Paul forever. All these months, a part of her had clung to a slender thread of hope, praying that one day, somewhere down the line, they'd be reconciled, their differences forgotten. But now, that hope was about to be cut forever. She felt a brief urge to turn and run, leaving the entire situation unresolved. But when she closed her eyes, the feeling passed. She hadn't come all this way just to linger on the doormat, with the pizza flyers and the free newspapers. As Paul's only next of kin, it was up to her to accept and mourn his loss, to go through his stuff and sort out the paperwork. Heart thudding, she stepped inside. Her boot heels clicked on the parquet floor. Ahead, a narrow galley kitchen lay at the end of the short hallway. On her right, an open door led into a lounge. Dirty footprints showed where the police and coroners had been about their business. The air held lingering traces of sweat and cheap aftershave. And beneath those, something organic, like the smell of a butcher's shop on a hot day. With her hand over her mouth and nose, she took a few paces into the room. Bloodstains darkened the wooden floor and papered walls, each accompanied by a handwritten label. Some drops had splattered the glass, and these had been circled and numbered in marker pen ink. Beyond the window, the Thames curled its way through the heart of the city, its surface the sullen hue of day-old coffee, chopped into ripples by the wind. She pulled her eyes away from the stains. Paul's medical qualifications hung framed on the wall above the fireplace. Beneath them, a flat-screen TV lay face down and smashed on the floor, having obviously been knocked over during a scuffle. The police had covered the sofa with a plastic sheet. Before it, a dozen old virtual reality games consoles lay heaped in various stages of disassembly on the low pine coffee table. Her gaze lingered over the accompanying screwdrivers, lumps of solder and twisted scraps of wire, as she remembered Paul tinkering with them 6 months ago, before their separation. He'd had a thing for retro machines, and, after hours in the operating theatre, he found the intricate work of restoring them calmed him. Her eyes were drawn back to the dried blood by the window. She swallowed. At her sides, her knuckles were white. Malhotra said, "Are you okay?" She turned to him. They were eye to eye, almost touching. She could smell the fusty bonfire reek of cigarettes on his breath and clothes. She took him by the lapels of his stupid coat. "Tell me how he died." The detective looked down at her hands. "I told you, he was murdered." "By who?" Malhotra took her by the wrists and gently pulled her hands free. He stepped back out of reach. "We don't know." Victoria leaned forward. "There's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" Malhotra wouldn't look at her. He scratched his cheek. "I don't know if I should. Just tell me." He took a deep breath. "Okay. Your husband. You knew he was bisexual, right?" Victoria let her arms fall to her sides. "Yes." Of course she did. She'd always known he swung both ways. For a brief moment they'd been in love. Then after the accident, for some reason, he'd stopped swinging her way. She touched the scar tissue at the side of her head. "Well, Malhotra continued, straightening his collar. "We think he might have been killed by someone he met, someone he brought back here for, you know, for sex." He glanced back down the hall towards the front door. Yeah. Not an intruder. There's no sign of forced entry, so we're assuming he knew his attacker." Victoria turned back into the room. She could feel the two halves of her mind butting up against each other, one in a turmoil of grief and jealousy, the other calmly weighing the facts. Her gaze fell on the stained floor. What about his soul catcher? The detective rubbed the back of his neck beneath the collar. "I'm afraid whoever attacked him took it with them. Ripped it right out, in fact." Victoria swallowed back the revulsion. Soul catchers were cranial implanted webs, similar to her own implants but much smaller and less invasive. They didn't penetrate the brain as hers did. They were simply used to record the wearer's neural activity, so that after death they could generate a crude, temporary simulation of that individual's personality, allowing them to say their goodbyes and tie up their affairs. In order to remove his soul catcher, Paul's assailant would have needed to crack open his skull, a procedure usually only carried out as part of an autopsy. Malhotra reached into his coat and pulled out a brown envelope, from which he extracted a photograph. He handed it to her, unable to meet her eyes. "This is how we found him." The photograph had been taken in this room, from almost the exact spot where Victoria now stood. The victim lay in a pool of thick, fresh blood, his head smashed open like an egg, and his skull disturbingly empty. She made a face and looked away. "Yes, that's him." "Are you sure?" She closed her eyes. "I'm sure." Despite the bruising and the hair matted to his face, there could be no doubt. The facial recognition software in her neural prosthesis confirmed it. "I'm afraid it gets worse," Malhotra said. He tapped the picture with his finger, drawing her attention back to the wet cavity revealed by the smashed skull. "His head's empty." The detective took the photo from her and slipped it back into his envelope. "Whoever it was, they took his brain." Stop that there. Oh. What? Sorry, stop that. So that's how the Monkey Book starts. That's how the trilogy starts, with a murder, and as you'll find out later in the book, a victim who won't stay quiet. So, how's time looking? How long did I go on there?
I've got time for another piece.
Yeah, I can do another piece. Unless anyone has any immediate questions. No? In that case, I've got another short piece, which is, you'll be pleased to know, is slightly cheerier. This is a piece that appeared online recently. I had an email from an online magazine. I think it was a Wednesday afternoon. The email came through and said, "We're putting together a piece about climate fiction, and would like you to write something about a 1,000-word story about the climate, which we're going to use. Margaret Atwood is writing an article, and we want some stories to illustrate it. We've got Bruce Sterling, and we'd like you to do it." I said, "Oh, great. When do you need it by?" He said, "Tomorrow." I said, "That's kind of short notice." He said, "Well, we'll pay you $1,000. Okay." So this is probably the quickest story I've ever written, but it's also, because it went up on that site next to Bruce Sterling and Margaret Atwood, it's also the most read story I have ever written, which is slightly frustrating in some ways, because I slaved over some of the others for months and I've not had nearly the readership this has. This is called Ride the Blue Horse. As I say, it's only 1,000 words long, but I'm quite fond of the two characters in it. So, Ride the Blue Horse. We were breaking into shipping containers the day we found the Blue Horse. My friend Dan had convinced me we should give it a shot. The stacks were dangerous, but since getting the sack from the call centre, we were desperate. I heard of a guy 2 towns over, Dan said, rocking back and forth on his heels in the call centre parking lot, who cracked a container of canned fruit, peaches, cherries and mandarins, stuff you don't see anymore. It made him rich. How rich? Rich enough to leave town. We had to walk to the freight yard, and it took us the whole day. Heat shimmered off the empty road. The place had been abandoned since we were kids. With the big ships gone, it just hadn't been economical to keep open. And once the port authority stopped dredging, it only took a couple of years for silt to choke the harbour. All that was left now were these rusting container stacks and the wiry little green fireworks of grass that had pushed their way up through the shattered tarmac. The perimeter fence had been smashed down in several places. "Are you sure there's going to be anything left?" I said. Dan gave me one of his looks. He was still wearing his call centre clothes, dark jeans with a white shirt and black tie, and his top button was undone. "Look at the size of the place. It's about 1 bazillion square kilometres. There are literally thousands of crates." He stepped through the fence with the sprightly confidence of a door-to-door evangelist. "The ones at the edges may have been looted, but I'll bet you there's still plenty of good shit further in." "You had better be right." "Of course I am." He clapped his hands together and rubbed them briskly. "Now come on, Spellman, let's hustle." As it turned out, he was right, but we had to open 6 crates before we found her. The first 3 were full of plasma TVs, electric kettles, and other unusable junk. The 4th was empty, and the 5th strewn with the discarded rags of a shipment of long-forgotten immigrants. At that point, I was ready to give up for the night. The sun had gone down and the sky was ripening towards the colour of a day-old bruise. Dan convinced me to continue. "Just one more." He slapped the side of the next container in line, and the metal made a deep, booming sound. "Come on," he said. "I've got a great feeling about this one." Unfortunately, Dan injured himself as we were prying off the lock. The crowbar slipped and the end of it gashed his palm. "God damn it!" "Are you okay?" "Just peachy." I watched him suck the wound. Thankfully, it didn't seem deep. We both knew we didn't have enough money to get him a tetanus shot. With his hand still in his mouth, he kicked the door. "Get this sucker open, Spellman." "Yes, sir." I stooped to retrieve the fallen crowbar and carefully popped the lock. The door opened on rusty hinges. "What have we got?" I frowned into the gloom. "Some jerry cans and kit bags, and something wrapped in a tarpaulin. I think it might be a car." Dan pushed past me. "Well, there's no need to sound so disheartened." He crouched in front of the covered vehicle and pulled at the edge of its shroud. "Voila!" The cloth came away and he stood there like a conjurer awaiting the applause of the crowd. I looked at what he had uncovered. "Pretty car." "Pretty?" He dropped the edge of the tarpaulin and walked around to the driver's door. His fingertips brushed the blue painted bodywork. "You don't even know what this is, do you, Spellman?" "Nope." He shook his head sadly as if disappointed in me. "It's a 1960s Ford Mustang with a V8 engine and 4-speed manual gearbox." Dan was quite the student of classic Americana. Plus, his dad had once owned a garage out near the interstate. He opened the door and slid behind the wheel. "And the keys are in the ignition." I walked over and kicked one of the jerry cans. The dull thump told me it was full. I unscrewed the lid. "This is petrol. And these bags are full of camping supplies and dehydrated ration packs." Dan was beside me in an instant. "Put all of it in the trunk." I raised an eyebrow. "You think it's worth something?" "Are you kidding?" He helped me load the car and then we both climbed in. "You know what this is?" He gave the steering wheel an affectionate pat. "It's somebody's cash. It's their end-of-the-world backup plan. Only they never came back for it." He laughed. "Just imagine for a moment some wannabe Mad Max trapped in the departure lounge in Washington or Buenos Aires, knowing the planet's going to hell, but being unable to reach all the gear he so carefully squirreled away." He pulled a pair of sunglasses from the glove box and admired himself in the rearview mirror. "So," I said, "how much do you think we can sell it for?" He looked aghast. "Where's your imagination, Spellman? This might be the last functional car in America. Do you know how far a blue horse like this could get us on a full tank of gas? At least 200 or 300 miles. And then we've got the refills in the trunk. And when they run out, then what? And then we've got all this neat camping gear. And these rations, I'll bet they're super tasty. They'll keep us going until we find someplace. He put his hand on my shoulder. I could feel warm, sticky blood soaking through my t-shirt. We can hit the road right now and never come back to this ungrateful crap hole. My skin prickled the way it did before a thunderstorm. Not ever. Nope. He lit the headlights and we blinked against their sudden brilliance. One question. I fastened my seatbelt. Do you actually know how to drive? He turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed twice and then bellowed. The metal walls amplified the sound. I caught a whiff of carbon monoxide. Dan released the parking brake. Nope, I can't say I do. With his bloodied hand, he crunched the gear stick into first and eased up the clutch. We began to roll forwards. But really, how hard can it be? Yeah, I like those two.
You have some questions?
Yes, please.
During the Monkey trilogy, like how I don't think how did Norway join the kingdom?
How did they join?
Yeah, because obviously in '59 you have the signing, but then I think it's in the third book where it's like, oh, it's 100 years since Norway joined.
Yeah, the whole England joining France thing is something a lot of readers have found, especially French readers, very difficult to believe. The irony is, of course, it was very nearly almost true. I got it from actual government documents that in 1956 the French Prime Minister Mollet did come to England with that proposal that because we were fighting the Suez crisis together and because their economy was absolutely shagged, and we'd been very close during the Second World War a few years before, that maybe we should enter into a sort of political merger with the Queen as the head of state. I have no idea how he would sell a monarchy to the French people, but he actually put forward this. And in our world, Anthony even said no, and we fell out over the Suez crisis, and we cozied up to America, and they cozied up to Germany. But apparently, in the documents I was reading, Norway were quite interested to see what would happen if this happened, and there was some suggestion that if France and England joined, there'd be a sort of pile-on effect of all the other countries recovering from the Second World War, going me too, and we would have had sort of an effective European Union then with the power in Paris and London instead of where it is at the moment in Brussels and Berlin. Any other questions?
How did you get into science fiction in the first place?
I can't remember. I was about 3 or 4. There's a local library in the village, and my mother used to take myself and my siblings there every week and get out 3 or 4 books each and read them. And I always used to read the books with the rockets on the cover. And we used to watch Star Trek on the old black and white TV we had. I was gutted when we finally got a colour one in 1975, and Kirk's jumper was yellow. I always thought it was blue. Because I had a favourite pair of pyjamas I thought looked like his uniform. They were blue. It was a crushing disappointment. But yeah, so I grew up with that. I grew up with seeing the Skylab on the TV, and there were astronauts in space, and it just seemed that we were going to live in space. So I had a favourite book when I was very, very young called You Will Live on the Moon. It was like a guide to children what you will do when you live on the moon when you grow up. This is how you'll get there. This is a spacesuit you will wear. This is how high you'll be able to jump. And I thought, yeah, okay, that sounds good. We'll all be up there by 1985. It'll be brilliant. But yeah, as I grew up, that just kind of stayed with me, and it was always the stories that were the most interesting. In secondary school, I got given a book of Arthur C. Clarke short stories as an assignment. Everyone in the class got a different book, and I got Arthur C. Clarke, and it just blew my mind. And from that moment on, it was always where I was going to go.
Who are your biggest influences? Is it Arthur C. Clarke? Who's your
I'd
Is
say
that the same who to read, who would you say?
in terms of writing, I think my biggest influences are probably William Gibson, specifically sort of New Romancer era. I think that probably comes across. These books have been quite compared to that in a lot of ways. Philip Dick, just in terms of crazy speculation. J.G. Ballard as well, in terms of writing. But also sort of in terms of writing very simple language to describe action, probably Raymond Chandler and Hemingway had a big influence there, just on writing very simply but very with a great attention to small detail.
When the Ack-Ack Macaque first short story came, was a trilogy already at the moment?
No, absolutely not. No, I just I wrote an original short story about a man who was in love with an artist who had an animated online series that she did, and I needed a cartoon character, and I came up with Ack-Ack Macaque as the cartoon character. So for the short story, he was just a throwaway cartoon character idea who accidentally took over the world and ate the internet. And I forgot about him. The short story that he was in actually came first in the 2007 Interzone Readers' Poll for favourite short story of the year. And lots of people said, "Oh, you should do something with him. You should do something with him." But I kind of felt I'd said everything I wanted to say about that story, which wasn't really about him. It was about the humans. But then I wrote a space opera called The Recollection for Solaris Books. And when I handed that in, the editor, John Oliver, said to me, "So, Gareth, have you got anything else you want to write?" I said, "Yes." "Can you give me half an hour and I'll go away and think of something?" So I went away, and I'd been kicking around this idea for a kind of murder mystery plot about a serial killer removing people's brains, and with a lot of Zeppelins on board, and I wanted to say something about what it meant to be human by exploring the sort of borderlands of humanity. So I had Victoria, who we just heard from, who's got half a computer brain, half a real brain, and she's not quite sure where the two separate. And had other characters in there, which I don't want to give too much away, but one who used to be human and is now a computer recording, one who thinks he's completely human, then finds out he might be something slightly different. And in order to complete the set, I needed a character who never had been human, but could kind of think on that level. And I sort of rooted around in the attic of my brain, and there was this monkey sitting there drumming his fingers, going, "About bloody time." So, yeah, he just fitted in so brilliantly, and immediately the book completely became about him, and I had to, which was a good thing, because he's such an overbearing character, he takes over any scene he's in, that I really had to raise my game and really make the other characters as good in order that he wouldn't completely swamp them. I didn't want it to be a book with just one wacky character and a load of kind of straight men. I don't mean that like that. I mean, you know, comedy straight men feeding him lines. But so I had to kind of really invest in the other characters too, which was a good thing.
What's your favourite character that you've ever written?
My favourite character that I've ever written? Christ, I've never been asked that before. I don't know. That's like asking which of your children is your favourite. But I mean, I've obviously got a sneaking fondness for the monkey, and I don't think I'll ever quite completely shake him off. He's always going to be there. I've written 2 more novels since finishing this trilogy. Both no monkeys at all, no talking animals, no talking animals at all, just to get a change of pace. But yeah, I think our names are forever going to be interlinked. So yeah, I'm very fond of him, but I'm very fond of Victoria as well. I think during the course of the trilogy, she's the character that goes on the biggest journey. She starts off in that chapter I've just read, a sort of a former journalist trying to recover her life after a serious head wound, and her estranged husband murdered, and she goes on a big journey through the trilogy. So by the end of the trilogy, she's much different than when she started. She's much more. She's discovered herself in a lot more ways. They all have in some ways. I mean, they all change quite dramatically through the trilogy, and they all wind up in places they didn't expect from the start. I'm trying to say this without giving anything away. Yeah.
If you could give yourself some advice before you go back in time, what advice would you give to yourself if you're starting out as a writer?
Back when I started out, buy shares in Apple. If I could give, I would have started earlier, I think. So I didn't start writing seriously till I was 30. And my first novel wasn't published till I was 40. So I've written seven novels in 5 years, which is crazy. Yeah, and I'm working on my 8th at the moment. But you know, I think I probably could have fit a few in during my 20s and early 30s if I'd really tried. But on the other hand, I accrued a lot of experience during those years, which I can now mine in my writing. I think I tried to write a novel when I was a creative writing student at the University of Glamorgan. And it never really got anywhere because I don't think I had the experience to do it at that point. I hadn't read widely enough. You know, I was just trying to rewrite a Jack Kerouac novel, basically. And Jack Kerouac had already done that with varying degrees of success. And yeah, I'd say if I could give myself advice, it would be read more, live more, drink slightly less.
Do you have a sense of where science fiction is going now? Is it changing a lot?
It's changing enormously, very quickly, but I think if I had an idea of where it was going, I wouldn't be here. I'd be at home banging out bestsellers. It's difficult to say. It's going in a lot of different directions all at once, as always, really. It always will. There's some fantastic books out at the moment. There's a book by a lady called Anne Leckie called Ancillary Justice, and there's 2 sequels. It's a fantastic book. It's similar to Ian Banks's space operas. It's about a giant conscious spaceship, but who finds its brain trapped in a human body, and it comes from a culture where there is no distinction between male and female, apart from sort of culturally there's no distinction, and so everybody in the book is referred to using feminine pronouns. So you just have to guess from the clues in the narrative, of which there aren't very many, which character is a male and which character is a female. And reading it, you soon become used to it. It's a bit jarring when you start that everyone is called she, but you start to become really accustomed to it, and it becomes quite strange then to come back to a world where people are divided into he and she. So that's definitely worth it, and it's a cracking adventure as well. So it's definitely worth reading. My very close friend Emma Newman has just released a book called Planetfall, which I think is going to win a load of awards this year. It's set on another planet, but it's about a character struggling with mental problems that become obvious during the course of the book to everyone except the narrator. And it's just an amazing book. It blew me away when she gave it to me to read before she handed it in. So I think that's definitely, everyone rush out and buy that one because that's going to win a ton of awards this year.
So I'm guessing from what you've just said that you're more a fan of soft science fiction than hard science fiction, which that's correct?
I grew up reading a lot of hard science fiction like Clarke and Niven and Heinlein, and I don't really like the distinction between hard and soft. I try to get everything in my books as plausible as possible. I'm not above making something up if it needs to for the plot, but I try not to do anything that's blatantly impossible. So from that point of view, I have hard sympathies, but a lot of the hard science fiction, or core science fiction as it's called now, I find it quite fairly bloodless. It's about quite capable characters sorting out a problem. And while it has interesting locales and problems, it has very little in the way of, I feel, of character. And there's not enough character, not enough humanity. So I wouldn't say I was definitely a fan of one or the other, but I think elements of both. I'm getting very croaky now.
Well, don't feel pressurised to think of a question. Please hang around and finish the wine, and if you want to buy a book and get Gareth to sign it, I'm sure he'll ask any questions one-on-one or man. But I'd like to thank Gareth for coming, and I appreciate you all for coming as well. Next, I did say that Damien Wolford Davis would be here tomorrow, but we've had to cancel because he's had work issues or work. And we're going to try and book that again for next time. Our next event will be Mary Ann Constantine, who's written a book called Starshot, and had a song reading last Thursday of this month. But thank you very much for Gareth for coming, and please hang around and drink wine for me.